Hello? Sure. I emailed you a link to the presentation. Okay.
Okay, if you guys are ready, I'm going to go ahead and start the webinar. Is that okay? All right, for those of you that are joining us, we are going to get started in just a few minutes. Just making sure everything is operational. We'll start at 6 o'clock. So thank you for joining us tonight. And we'll be back on with you shortly. just about ready to get started on this beautiful Little Rock afternoon. All right, it is 6 o'clock. Good evening. Thank you all for joining us tonight for our May preservation conversation, Homes of Architects in Greater Little Rock with Mason Toms. I'm Patricia Blick, the Executive Director of the QQA, and I'm joined by Shelley Stormo, our Membership and Events Coordinator. I'd like to thank our donors as well as our corporate and individual members. We are able to continue our education programs with your support. You can find a list of our corporate members on our website at quapaw.com. If you are not a member of the QQA and you believe in our mission, preserving Greater Little Rock's historic places, we invite you to join and support the work that we do. Please go to quapaw.com to join for as little as $35 per year or to make a donation. If you join or donate at the $100 level, you will receive our Never, Never, Never Give Up t-shirt. Before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to let you know that we will be taking your questions at the end of the talk. Please type them in the chat area of Zoom. And we are also sharing this program on YouTube. So if you have questions, you can enter them into the comments section. On to tonight's preservation conversation. I am very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, my friend and colleague, Mason Toms. Mason Toms is a native of Arkansas and a graduate of the Fay Jones School of Architecture and Design at the University of Arkansas. He works as an architectural historian in the National Register and Survey section of the Arkansas Historic Preservation Program, an agency of the Department of Arkansas Parks, Heritage, and Tourism, where he specializes in modern architecture. In a further effort to increase public awareness and appreciation for the many remarkable modernist structures in Arkansas, Mason created and continues to administer the Facebook group Arkansas Modernism, which features a different modernist-inspired building in the state of Arkansas every Friday. And those are a lot of fun, so I encourage you to join. Please welcome me. Please join me as we welcome Mason.
Thank you. Let's get this thing started. All right, as Patricia said, we're going to look at a few houses. Obviously, we're not going to be able to look at all the houses of architects in Pulaski County, the greater Little Rock area, but we are going to look through a few of them. Architects have long been the creators of our built environment. Whether it be the spaces in which we work, play, or live, their touch is seen all around us. However, it is in the design of residences that their impact is most felt. While the commercial and educational structures where we spend our days constitute an influence on a significant influence on our lives, they are still more a reflection of the image of that company or institution than they are of the people that inhabit them. It is really only in the home that we find a reflection of not only the personal taste and design of the inhabitants, but also their ideals and values. Though all houses have the same basic program, they have the ability to manifest in vast variety of forms, each tailored to varying degrees to the needs of their and desires of the occupants. However, when it comes to the homes of architects, the domestic typology is taken to a realm beyond necessity and decoration. These homes are not the product of clever ad campaigns and promotions, nor are they the vision of how another architect felt that a house should take form. Instead, the architect's home is a unique expression of that particular architect's ideas on the house. These houses contain the pure vision of the architect without the filter of the client requirement or client egos muddying up the water. Because of this, their study can provide valuable insight into the architect's mind and philosophy of design. That same philosophy, which made their work so influential and significant, is best seen in their personal homes, as it is in that setting that the architect's mind is the least restrained. Architects have long built their own houses, or built houses for themselves across the country. And some of the most famous houses in the country are architects' homes, obviously Monticello being one of the oldest architects' homes surviving in the country. But Frank Lloyd Wright, with his Oak Park studio being a very previously visited destination, also being very significant. And all of these houses really relate to their overall body of work. You can see direct correlation between the architect's house and what they design for other people. We can see a similar pattern in the architects of Arkansas, and specifically of Pulaski County, and the houses they design for themselves. The earliest architect that we actually have a house surviving for, which there was a big limitation. Arkansas had several architects during the late 19th century. However, most of their houses don't survive. The earliest one that does survive belonged to one of the Pfeiffer brothers, or Pettifer brothers. The Pettifer brothers advertised themselves as architects and builders. There's no evidence that they actually had formal architectural training, but a lot of builders during that period also called themselves architects because they would design buildings to be built. Really, the only works that we know about them that are confirmed by them is, of course, their masterwork, which is Trinity Episcopal Cathedral. But also there was once a series of cottages along 24th Street that actually one of the Pettifer brothers, Harry Pettifer, lived in, and had two accompanying cottages. Unfortunately, all of these cottages aren't there anymore. But Ambrose Pettifer, the oldest brother, or the elder brother, built a house for himself at the end of Cumberland at 2216, what is now 2216 South Cumberland, in 1886. Like I said, this is the oldest surviving home of an architect in Pulaski County. And it's kind of a different look from what you'd expect, especially when you look at the cottages, which were rather elaborate Victorian cottages. This is a much simpler house, almost looks like a farmhouse. But you have to keep in mind that when this house was built, it was actually outside the city. So its farmhouse appearance is very much reflective of the fact that when it was built, there was nothing else around it. And even if you look at this house today, go and visit that area, the street, which is just north of the old VA hospital, it is significantly older than everything else around it. Really, the most historic houses on the street that it's on all date to the 20s. So this sat by itself for quite a long time. Of course, after that, there starts to be a lot more architects, and some of their houses survive. One of the most prolific architects during the period who has many houses that survive was Frank W. Gibb, who lived from 1861 to 1932. Gibb was a rather prolific architect around the state. He designed several courthouses around the state, as well as just a lot of architectural landmarks throughout Arkansas. And he's rather known for these very large, grand buildings. And even the houses he designed for other clients around the state were generally large, grand houses. Now, in his own architecture, the first place that he shows up as living while he's practicing as an architect was actually his father's house at 1603 South Arch Street, which was built about 1886. Like I said, this wasn't a house that he lived in for himself, that he designed for himself, but he is credited with the design. His father's family, or his family, actually had a building company, so Gibbs designed a lot of spec houses. This house was probably originally designed as a spec house to attract other people to want a house from the Gibbs construction company. The second house that he lived in, which is the first one that he lived in by himself, or actually with his wife, but outside of his parents' house, was located just down Arch Street at what is now 1858, but the original address was actually 1908. Streets got renumbered at one point. This was built somewhere around 1890. This house, like actually almost every other house that he lived in, was a spec house. He didn't intend to stay in this house, and he didn't really design it for his family. He designed it more as just a house to kind of show off his architectural skills and hopefully attract more clients. However, the second house that he built was the one, what is known as the Frank Gibb House number 3. There was another house. There was a house between the house Frank Gibb House number 1 and Frank Gibb House number 2, or number 3. However, it was located on 18th Street and doesn't survive. So we have no real idea of what that one looked like. But the house that he built on 1801 South Arch Street in 1910 is the only house that we believe that he actually built for himself and for his family. The rumor is actually kind of that he actually built this house for his daughter's coming out party because it has this very, very grand staircase right inside the entry, which is perfect for making your debut into society. One of the more interesting things about this house is the fact that the front is actually the side. The big porticoed porch that's kind of the showcase of the house and makes you think the front of the house is the side of the house, whereas the main entrance to the house is actually on the side of the other side around the corner from it, which you can see in the photo. However, the Gibbs didn't live in this house very long. He built it in 1910, and by 1912, they were actually staying at the Capitol Hotel. They kind of went bankrupt. He spent more money on the house than he really had to spend and couldn't afford to stay in it. That was followed by him moving back down towards his father's house at 1609 South Arch Street, in a house that they had previously built in 1886, around the same time that they built his father's house. This one, like his earlier houses, was done in a more kind of general Victorian style, not really the classical style. So you can kind of see that when left to his own devices, the house that he'd like to live in would be a grand classical house, rather like the grand classical buildings he designed around the state. But as is the case, I think a lot of times with architects, his taste in architecture did not reflect his bank account properly. So he generally would live in houses that he thought were more in taste with the general public's taste for architecture at the time. And this is actually where he would continue to stay for the rest of his life, was in the Frank Gibb House number 4. Similar to Gibb is Charles Thompson, and Charles Thompson's really an architect that doesn't really need much of an introduction in most of Arkansas. He's probably one of the most famous and most prolific architects around the state. He started working with Benjamin Bartlett in the late 19th century, and really created the longest lasting firm west of the Mississippi in the United States. Thompson is known for scores of beautiful buildings, including a whole string of courthouses. I think there's more than a dozen in total that he designed, as well as beautiful commercial, religious, and civic buildings around the state as well, libraries and such, lots of banks. And all of these houses and all of these buildings are very, very grand buildings, huge buildings. And really a lot of the houses he designed were very grand, elaborate houses in a variety of styles, which is really interesting. He was really kind of flexing his architectural know-how, and that he kind of did a whole range. He did everything from classical revival, such as you see in the Murrellsgate Plantation House. The Fordyce House is the only known Egyptian revival residence in the state. And it's a very rare style in America in general. So having a house of it is just kind of a very unique feature. And even kind of branched out into the prairie style with the Rotan House. So you kind of left to wonder, what would he do for himself? Well, Thompson's first residence when he kind of struck out on his own was actually a little house on 2113 Spring Street. However, that building doesn't survive. There's a modern duplex there that was built in the post-war period. But not long after, around 1892, he constructed this, what's generally referred to as the Charles Thompson Cottage, or Charles Thompson House number 1 at 2114 Spring, basically across the street from where he had previously lived. And this house is very kind of in line with what architectural taste would have been for houses at the time. I mean, much smaller, much simpler, but still a fairly elaborate house for what it was. But already you kind of see there's some weird blending of styles going on. You've got, obviously the overall form is very kind of Victorian, very Queen Anne. Whereas on the porch, you've got these kind of more classical revival or colonial revival columns. And this was, as well as having the dentil molding right above the columns. This blending of styles is actually something that he did quite a bit on other projects, but here it seems like he's kind of more playing with it to see what styles can go together and still kind of pull off an overall look. Actually, and then when he stayed in this house until about 1906, when he built a larger house on Broadway at 2015 South Broadway. And this house kind of shows us a couple different things. The first thing is that he had obviously moved up significantly in prominence because Broadway back at this point was really where you wanted to live if you were kind of the who's who. This was a lot of the large houses. And at one point, actually, there were several architects that lived along Broadway and at various times. The famous architect Eugene Stern lived a few doors down from him at one point. But like his cottage, this house is also a weird blending of styles. Overall, the form is a four-square, which is not really a style. It's just kind of an architectural form, generally referred to because the lower level is 4 square rooms. And then they would make it more elaborate with additions and whatnot. But this 4 square has the general appearance of being a mission revival architecture, which 1906 is early for Arkansas with mission revival. And you can see that in that dormer, kind of the curves and also in the tile roof. Those are classic details of the mission revival style. But then he throws in a weird column again. If you look at the column, which you have the blown up picture there, he put a lotus column on it, kind of a nod almost to the Fordyce house with the Egyptian revival style. So yeah, again, he's doing these kind of weird combinations. But one of the most interesting things about this house isn't this weird combination. It's the fact that it's kind of plain. It's a lot simpler than you would expect for Thompson, given all of his other designs, which are generally fairly elaborate. So it's not really a house that you would picture for him to live in, but this is the house where he spent the rest of his life. He was a pretty simple architect, or pretty simple to track down because he only lived in 2 places. George R. Mann is another architect from that same period of architecture in Arkansas. And he's really mainly known for doing large buildings, large grand buildings. And you can see here, he did the Pulaski County Courthouse Annex in 1913, the Hotel Pines in Pine Bluff, and also in 1913, and the Arkansas Bacon Trust in Newport in 1916. All of them really being these large Beaux Arts style buildings. That's really the style that he's mainly known for. And yet his first house that we see him living in himself, like originally the first few times he shows up in the city directories, he shows up either in a boarding house or in a hotel. So the first house he shows up in is this one, which is the Turner Mann House, built by Sue Turner, which was a remarkable female developer at the turn of the century. This house was not designed specifically for him, but he was the second occupant to live in the house. And it is believed that he actually did design the house. So again, this is an architect who's known for these grand classical inspired designs. And yet the house he lives in, or house he designed, which he lived in, is kind of a weird blending and almost a little cutting edge for architecture at the time. It was built around 1905, and it has these features that kind of lend itself to a prairie design. If you look at Frank Lloyd Wright's Winslow House, it has a similar kind of delineation of spaces, as well as these big overhanging eaves and this kind of horizontal feel to it. Even the diamond windows that you see are sometimes linked to prairie style architecture. And then you've got like this mission style front porch on it, which is just kind of an odd addition to it. It flows together fairly well, but it is a weird contrast of styles because it doesn't quite go with the cleanness that you see of the rest of the design. He lived in this house until about 1932, when he moved into a house, or built a house over on North Lookout at 4701 North Lookout. Now this house is much simpler than his previous house, and much simpler than you would expect for George R. Mann, but maybe that's what he was wanting. This was towards, he was getting older. Maybe he wanted a simpler house that still had kind of these classical nods to it and almost a colonial feel to it. And he lived in this house until about 1938, when he moved over to Country Club Boulevard, or Country Club. But fortunately, the house he lived in on Country Club doesn't exist anymore. So these 2 houses are the only houses that we know of that still exist that Mann lived in. And they show a very kind of different side to man's architectural thought, um, being more that maybe his grand designs, which he's known for, were done because he knew he would get paid a lot of money for it. But when left to his own devices, he went with something simpler or more progressive. Theo Sanders was a big architect, eventually became a partner of Charles Thomson. He lived several places around Little Rock, but unfortunately, only two of them survive. His architectural portfolio is impressive, to say the least. Um, he did some of the most beautiful kind of classical and colonial revival buildings, or revivalist style buildings. But then he also did the Union Bank building in Little Rock in 1929, which was arguably the best example of Art Deco architecture ever constructed in the state. Unfortunately, that building doesn't survive. But the first house he lived in, which doesn't survive, was on 13th Street. The first surviving house that he lived in was this house, the Kempner House at 521 South Rock. The beautiful Italianate style house, obviously he didn't design it. It was built in 1867, and he didn't move in until 1907, or about 19, yeah, between 1906 and 1907. It's easy to see why an architect would want to live in this house. This house is kind of a textbook of the Italianate style. It's beautifully designed, graciously outfitted, and in a prominent area. However, he stayed in that house until about 1911 when he moved to a house at 1106 Center. That house, unfortunately, does not survive. After that house, he moved to a house at 2405 Gaines in 1917. That house also doesn't survive. So we don't really know if he designed these houses or not. We think he probably did design the house on Gaines and the house on Center, but nothing remains of them, so we don't know what they look like. But his last house that he lived in is at 1907 South Gaines, which he built in 1919. And this one does survive. Similar to Mann, this is not the house that you would expect for Sanders. You would almost expect something a little bit more progressive. This is kind of an interesting and odd blend of colonial and craftsman style architecture. You've got this colonial revival porch on it, and symmetrical facade, which wasn't terribly common in craftsman architecture. High craftsmen always had asymmetrical facades, but a lot of craftsman details with the braces along the roof line and especially the windows. And like I said, he would live in this house and for the rest of his life. And still, though, it's shows that maybe his aesthetic for his commissions was something grander than his aesthetic for himself. He wanted something simpler. This house is, fairly clean lines, leaning towards being more prairie style, but still not there. But it still has these traditional touches. So it's almost kind of straddling this line between traditional and progressive architecture at the time, which makes it a really interesting example, but somewhat confusing example, especially because of the mixture of the stucco with the horizontal siding. John Parks Ullman, similar to Sanders, lived in several places, but unfortunately, most of them don't survive. John Parks Ullman is known for a lot of stuff. A lot of people associate him with churches because he designed a number of churches around the state. As you can see here, First Presbyterian in Lone Oak, and First United Methodist in Wilmot are two of his kind of opposite ends of his career examples of his work. Also, the old high school, which is one of the best examples of Spanish eclectic architecture in the state. It's a really remarkable building. Granted, he also did the Lane Hotel in Rogers, which is a beautiful example of Spanish eclectic architecture. He also designed several houses. It seems that at one point in his career, he really preferred the Tudor Revival style. You can see here in the Land's End Plantation House in Scott that was built in 25, and the Bransford House in Lone Oak built about the same time, both being beautiful and kind of textbooks examples of the Tudor Revival style in residential architecture. So it should come as no surprise that his first surviving house, which is located at 324 East Daisy Bates, they built in 1921, around the same time as he did his houses, is also Tudor Revival. And this is really, despite its kind of compact footprint, it's a really remarkable example of the style. You can see it's got all of the all of the trademark details of the style, including elaborate woodwork, great brackets, tile roofs, the half timbering on the upper floors, and a brick lower level. This house was really as much of probably a billboard for Parks or for Allman as it was, a place for him to live. It was at a prominent street, a very busy street. So a lot of people would see this house, and especially with it being on a corner, you could see more around. You could see around it better. So in a lot of ways, this really was probably more an architectural advertisement for him than anything else. He lived in this house from about 1921 until about the early 1930s when he moved to a house at 1305 Louisiana. Unfortunately, that house doesn't survive. So we don't really know what that one looks like. But he did build another house later in his life up on Palisades. In some ways, this house is very surprising. It's at 27 East Palisades, and he built it in 1954, kind of as his retirement home. It seemed to follow the kind of more ranch style of the time, and it's just kind of remarkable, given that he never really. It's just simpler than you would expect for him. It's not the house that you would think, but it was where a lot of architectural trends were going, and so maybe that's really where it came from. It has a traditional style, which you would see in his work and even during the mid-century period, because he continued to do buildings into the 50s, where he would still have these very traditional touches. And even though he did start to experiment with Art Deco architecture in some modern forms, as you could see in the Wilmot Church earlier, there was always this kind of piece of him that never really wanted to leave the revival styles. Here you can see that kind of feel to it. I think he tried to make it more modern by having this offset recessed porch, but you still have a colonnaded porch and a very kind of colonial nods in the architecture with the dormers and the way the windows are designed. On the rear of the house, you have, which is what the second photo, the black and white photo is, you have kind of almost these Romanesque influences with these large semicircular projections. So it's just kind of a mishmash of styles and really an odd choice for his retirement home. And really, I don't know what it says about his architecture ideas at the time. Like I said, he may have been more trying to evolve with the architecture of the time, but still keeping a firm grasp on his kind of more traditional roots. George Wittenberg, in contrast to the other architects we've talked about, George Wittenberg wins the prize for having the most houses still survive. He lived in a number of places around Little Rock over the course of his career. Really, the Wittenberg and Deloney firm, which started in the late teens, got a lot of its early kind of work, and it's really made a name for itself early on in educational architecture. They designed several buildings on the campus of UCA in Conway. They designed several buildings at University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. And one of, I think, most underrated, but under-discussed buildings that they designed was the Dunbar Junior Senior High in Little Rock in 1929, which was one of the early premier examples of Art Deco architecture in Arkansas, built about the same time as Sanders Union National Bank. This one is a subtle Art Deco, but it's pretty spectacular, especially given that was cutting edge architectural style in the state at the time, and it was done for an African American school. Kind of speaks a lot about how they felt, architecture should be something for everybody. But anyway, they also, like Thompson and Gibb before them, they designed several courthouses. Given their period when they were doing this, these were both WPA courthouses, so they're more streamlined. Jokingly, this is called WPA modern style. Really, it's a very simple Art Deco. But so what would his houses look like? Well, the first house he lived in Little Rock on his own was this house at 310 West 23rd Street. We don't know for certain, but we think that he may have designed this house because if he was not the first occupant, he was the second. This house was built about the same time. And interestingly, it had a twin next to it. And I say that interestingly because it comes up, that trend comes up again in later architecture of his. But this is a house that you would very much expect to see around that period. You've got craftsman influences, large porches, and a lot of traditional style, a lot of traditional design elements to the house. So this may not have been as much of a billboard house, kind of like John Park Salmon's house was, but this one was definitely one that shows that he knows how to use the kind of trends or the upcoming architectural styles. His second house that he built in 1921 was located at 2708 South State Street. This one too has a twin next door, which is kind of an interesting trend they did. This one is a little bit interesting, a little bit more interesting than the last one. Again, it's a small cottage, rather like the last one was, his first house. But this one is kind of playing with more of this English cottage feel with some more colonial references, mainly in the porch and the columns. But very much done to look like a cottage house and a garden cottage house. House next door is very, very similarly designed. The interesting things about both of these is that they are rather small houses, even at the time, showing that he's kind of pointing out that houses don't have to be, something doesn't have to be grand or big to be grand. This house is beautifully designed, symmetrically done, showing kind of also accents of French eclectic style. So it's an interesting blend of architectural styles that is a very unique kind of representation. His third house was at 2422 South Louisiana. And this house was built around 1913. So it wasn't built specifically for him because he moved there around 1922, 1923. What's the kind of the funny thing about this house is at this point, his partner, Lawson Deloney, lived across the street. And they actually would live, Lawson Deloney lived there for quite a few years. But George Wittenberg moved in across the street, and you would see this happened a couple other times where they lived next to each other. This house, again, a craftsman house, very similar architecturally to the first house he did. The house is attributed to George Wittenberg as being its designer, but like I said, this house wasn't originally intended for him and his family to live in. So it's kind of curious that he did choose to live here. But if it's one of his own designs, it's still a reflection of his architectural taste. In 1913, this would have been a cutting edge architecture. And in 1923, craftsman style was still very much in vogue. So it's showing that he's an architect that keeps up with the times, but also being in a very prominent area of the city. He seems to have followed the crowds of Little Rock residents when they started moving west, when he built his fourth house at 4412 South Lookout, which he was built around 1917. So again, not built for him, but it is a design that's attributed to him. This one is far more traditional, or what would have been considered traditional at the time. This one isn't, it has some craftsman elements on the back, but really on the front, it's much more of a weird or an interesting blend of colonial revival elements. And it seemed like this kind of colonial revival was a taste or a style that he really seemed to like, because his final house that he built at 1711 North Palm was also a colonial revival house, and actually a really nice example of it. Far more traditional than his craftsman houses, but built about 1936. If you look on the left photo, that is what the house looked like when George Wittenberg lived in it. Symmetrically designed, ornate entrance surround, kind of a class, like a textbook example of late colonial revival architecture. It's gotten a little bit more colonial in recent years. You can see in the left or in the right picture, that's what the house looks like today. A lot of the house is still the Wittenberg design. They've just kind of made it more neo-Georgian than it was previously. However, like I said, this is kind of, it's an interesting take because he intentionally lived in what was progressively designed houses initially, and then reverts back to what were the more popular trends later. So it's an interesting look at like how he kind of saw architecture developing, and maybe maybe he was just really wanted more of a traditional flair in his own house. But the Wittenberg firm would go on to design some of the most progressive buildings. And their later partner, Julian Davidson, would design one of the few Usonian houses in central Arkansas, which was really progressive at the time. So it is kind of an interesting thought that he would build such a traditional house. Speaking of progressive architecture, Yindel Johnson was one of the big names in architecture or in modern architecture in Arkansas at the time. He's best known for his design for the National Old Line building across the street from the Capitol. You can see there what it originally looked like in 1955, and then he also designed the addition, which was completed in 1965. He was a prolific architect. He designed a few, he's known for designing several commercial buildings and churches and clinics and things, and all over the state. His work is primarily found in Pulaski County, but there's quite a bit of stuff found in Craighead County, where he lived for a time when he was partnered with Elmer Stuck. You can see here the Rogers Wickard Clinic, which used to be basically on the south end of the Capitol lawn, across the street from the south end of the Capitol lawn, where the parking lot for DFNA is now, are the Murdoch Acceptance Corporation building, both being great examples. However, he was primarily known for his residential architecture. He designed something like close to 300 residences around the state. Here you can see the Frank Thomas House in Little Rock from 1950, and the Dr. Schwartz House, also in Little Rock from 1954. His style changes a lot, and the best way that you can see how his style changed was in the three houses he built for himself. Around 1940, he built the first Yindel Johnson house, which is located at 2112 Riverview in the Capitol View area of Little Rock. This house is a really interesting house. It's very odd. It blends a very kind of traditional, almost Cape Cod-ish architecture with a lot of modern touches. The outside obviously looks fairly traditional, with almost a lean towards a style that's called minimal traditional, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's houses that have minimal detailing, but still looks like a traditional house. The siding, the cedar shingle siding on it, again, gives it that very traditional feel. But it being a split level is kind of one of the first signs that it's more of a modern house. The other thing is the windows, the way the windows operate, which were actually slider windows very early for 1940s. These were custom built for the house itself. And he actually designed the house next door to this one too, which is a similar style to this one. It's an odd one. But then a few years later, he turns around and builds this house at 3325 Lakeview in the Lakewood area of North Little Rock. Now, at the time when Lakewood was first getting started, there was this idea that Lakewood was going to be this modern neighborhood with modern houses. So they were really trying to drive that forward. And a lot of the designs that you see from the early 50s really were like high modern styles. Nolan Blast did a house there. There were several big name architects that did houses there. And so Yindel Johnson built this house there. And you can see this was almost an advertisement for modern living at the time. The stainless steel cabinets, the sleek linoleum floors, the way the bedroom was designed, everything about this house was really more of a modern living for, modern family kind of idea, almost more of a promotional house than anything else. But he lived here for quite some time. He actually stayed in this house until the 1960s when he built his third house. And in case you're wondering, this house does still exist. However, it's sad now. This is the house now. You can see the original house there. There's just more. However, that does not mean it's beyond restoration. Like I said, you can see the original house there. And it really was something pretty special, especially for 1949. The design of this house was remarkably modern, even for modern architecture in Arkansas, which really didn't take off until about 1950. So this is really one of the earliest modern residences designed in Pulaski County. And so it's really interesting. His third house was much more subtle. This house almost seems like the house he wanted to stay in, which actually it was his last house where he'd spend pretty much the rest of his life, or most of the rest of his life. Um, this one is much quieter, much more tucked back, very low slung, very low, and he intentionally diminished the presence of it from the street. But the back, on the other hand, has lots of glass, a lot very open to nature, very open in general, which you can see a parallel in this design to some of his residential commissions at the time, such as the Dr. Schwartz house that you saw earlier. This design is very similar. He kind of moved away from a flat roof, which he did on some designs. He was using these very, very shallow gable roofs. I guess really more for practicality purpose. It was easier to build, so it was also more economical. But it's these houses that kind of follow the trend of residential architecture during the mid-century period, which is where they're turning away from the street and really more focusing on the backyard, but really also kind of taking in this more almost Frank Lloyd Wright inspiration, where he's starting to use a lot more natural materials. When you compare that to the house he did in Lakewood, which was this very international style house, very clean, very industrial, this house is much more natural feeling, really meant to more interact with the environment and the landscape itself than be kind of the object in the landscape like the previous house. Like I said, you can see a reflection of this in his work, where a lot of his houses during this period end up being, these very kind of low slung, very earth incorporated designs. But you can't really talk about mid-century residential architecture without talking about Nolan Blass. Nolan Blass is probably one of the most well-known mid-century residential architects, and he designed dozens of houses all over the state. You can see, here's 4 examples. The upper left is the Newbill Porter House, which is in Little Rock. The one beside that is the Charles Dainty House in Dumas. Bottom left is the Stephen Brown House, also in Little Rock. And the bottom right is the Smart House in Pine Bluff. Blass is an interesting one because he never kind of found like a style that he liked. He liked jumping between styles or taking inspiration more from whatever was around him or kind of whatever tickled his fancy at the time. There's underlying stylistic currents, and you see layouts repeated over and over, but you don't really see a whole lot of his houses just don't really look that much alike. Occasionally you'll find a few that you can go, okay, that's a Nolan Blass house. But more often than not, they really don't look like each other. His commercial designs were very similar. He really did some of the most cutting edge commercial designs that were being built at the time. You can see the Blass department store that he designed for Pine Bluff, the Dara office building that's in Little Rock, and what was the Worthen Bank building in Little Rock. All of these were very cutting edge architecture at the time. The Blass building being one of the most beautiful, or when it was built, being one of the most beautiful Googie Googie designs in the state. The Dara building being a unusual but elegant new formalist design, and then the Worthen building being one of the best examples of brutalist architecture in the state when it was built. So what would you see in his house? Well, Blass only built one house that he stayed in for his entire life. And it's kind of an interesting one. Early on in Blass's career, he took a lot of inspiration from Frank Lloyd Wright, and that's really visible in this house. If you've ever been to, say, Frank Lloyd Wright's design for Wingspread, this cantilever off in the bottom right picture looks really familiar. This house is very, again, low to the earth, meant to more kind of blend with the landscape. It's covered in natural materials, brick and wood. It's meant to take in the landscape through views, but at the same time, it's really not really interacting with the street. It does have a small courtyard when you enter the house, but most of the glazing is on the back of the house. It's really meant to look at the yard. The Blass house, one of the most notable things about it was the first architect's residence in the state of Arkansas to be featured nationally. It was featured in an issue of Architectural Record, which is a pretty big deal because there wasn't a ton of stuff, it wasn't the first in the state, but it was It was featured about the same time that Faye Jones's house was featured. So really, it's an interesting house and very obviously a very significant architecture piece of architecture for Central Arkansas. And at the time, it would have been a really, really big deal. The house is, like I said, you can see a lot of kind of a lot of similarities, especially in the plan of this house with a lot of his other houses that he built later. The arrangement that he uses of rooms and how spaces flow from one to another is something that he repeated as far as the relationships go, but not really as far as the way they looked. A lot of times he would move stuff around to fit the site, and more importantly, to fit the client. He really believed that the client should drive to the design, so that each design should be its own unique piece, whether like the clients are all unique themselves. The last architect's house we're going to look at belonged to Robert Millett, better known as Bob Millett. Bob was one of the recruits that Ed Cromwell brought in 1950 when he was trying to help modernize architecture. And Bob did a lot of remarkable buildings. He was really known for his ability to move people around and to design cutting edge structures that also function incredibly well. Pretty much all of his buildings were always, had articles written about them, and it always mentioned how well they actually worked. The Reynolds Elementary School in Morrilton being a really interesting example, because really at that picture, if you look at it, that could be a school being built today. He was very progressive in his architectural designs. One of his proudest designs was for the Little Rock Airport, which actually was the basis for several international airports around the country. The way he laid that one out. Not much of it survives today. I mean, the part of it does, but not a whole lot of the original idea. But it was a cutting edge design at the time. Interestingly, though, he also designed churches, which is kind of a fun thing. There are at least 3 churches that we know that he designed. All of them have the same similar form. And if you really look at his background was MIT, but he also kind of studied underneath a lot of the early international style people. So everything was very functional. And that makes sense with his buildings. These churches were all kind of A-frame designs, which is a very efficient, very structural form, and makes sense with kind of this international style background. Which means no surprise when he builds his first house in 1952, it's an international style house. And really, this house took a lot of inspiration from several of Walter Gropius and Marcel Breuer's designs in the 30s in kind of the New England area of the country, where you have this vertical wood siding with this fieldstone accent. You can see in the upper left what the house looked like when it was built. It has had an addition put onto it. But actually, if you look closely in the upper left photo, you'll see a little girl on the lawn. That little girl is actually the owner today. She's the one that did the addition, and she was very sensitive about how the addition was done and really restored this house. If you would have looked at this house a few years ago, it didn't look anything like this. But it's a beautiful example, probably actually the best example of an international style house in Pulaski County. And it really, with the long, low lines, the flat roof, these kind of big bays of windows, it's just a really beautiful house, but also has very simple but very efficient circulation spaces. The hallways are short, and excuse me, it's easy to get around in. So again, he can move people around very well. But in his own house, he went for a much simpler approach where you don't need to move around a whole lot. Big open living, dining, kitchen space, which was very progressive for the time. However, the family kind of joked that while the first house was for Bob, the second house was for his wife. In 1961, Bob and his wife Marion built a second house, still in Lakewood. The last one, I'm sorry, was on Waterside, kind of in the area between Lakewood and Park Hill. Their second house was further in Lakewood, kind of in the middle of Lakewood at 5 Pine Tree Point. And this house is kind of a big contrast to his first one. The first one is, high international style, beautiful, sleek design. This one is much more more mainstream, I guess. It's got a gable roof. You see some similar material choices. Again, fieldstone with vertical with vertical wood siding, and it still has these very kind of modernist touches with these offset roof lines and projecting beam ends. But overall, it's a much more kind of mainstream, almost ranch overall feel to it. This house was more designed around the living spaces that his wife wanted. It had beautiful, like his first house, beautiful views of a lake. Yeah, it's a very different feel. But this one, I don't think, like I said, isn't really a reflection of Bob as much as it's a reflection of his wife. It's a very domestic house, not trying to be an architectural statement like his first house was. And so this one is also a much more settled architect. Unfortunately, Bob would pass away not terribly long after they moved into this house, about 10 years later, and his wife would move out. So they didn't enjoy this house that long. But this was really meant to be their forever home. It was a very age-friendly home. Everything was on the same level, easy to get around in. And so it's an interesting kind of contrast to the first one, and kind of leaves you with this odd idea of what it is that Bob Millet thought of residential architecture. Really, I think left to his own devices, he would have stayed in the first house. I think that really more suited him. But so that's all of the architects' houses that we have for you today. If you have any questions, or I actually have a whole list of other architects' houses all over the place. But these were the ones that kind of seemed to tell the best story with with the people that lived in them. So those were the reason why they were chosen.
Well, thank you very much, Mason. I thought that was really interesting. And the fact that they moved around quite a bit is not all of them, obviously, but several of them. I don't have any questions that have popped up. Shelley, do you have any questions that have come through YouTube?
I do not.
All right.
I mean, I will say one of the most interesting things about this was when I was looking up where all these architects lived. People may be familiar with Arthur McAninch, who was arguably one of the best Art Deco architects in the state of Arkansas. Interestingly, he didn't even build a house. He lived in an apartment almost his entire professional career. He didn't build a house till the very end, and when he did, it was a very traditional house. So it wasn't a house that you would expect for the Art Deco architect of Arkansas.
Maybe he was just very practical. I did have a question from Sarah Spencer. She was wondering, are all or any of these on the National Register, which you can answer that question.
A lot of them are. A lot of the early architects' houses are in historic districts. The Pettifer house is not in a district. It's something that we would like to look at. We just haven't been able to get in touch with the owners to talk to them about it. But most of the other architects' houses, at least the early ones, are on the National Register mainly because they're in historic districts. As Nolan Blass's house is individually listed. Let's see, Dindal Johnson's first house is in a district. I don't think his second house is. And Bob Millet's first house is listed. Unfortunately, his second house has several additions on it, so it's not really eligible for listing.
Gotcha. I had a question also from Mary McGee. She wanted to know, if you're willing to share it, who is the little girl that was sitting on the lawn who owns the Millet house now?
It's Bob and Marion's daughter.
Yeah.
The house happened to come up. She actually was living out of state and was planning to move kind of more eastward. And then the house happened to come on the market, and she told her husband, "Surprise, I'm moving to Arkansas." And so they bought the house, and very carefully, they worked with Gene Levy, who was one of Bob Millet's proteges, very carefully to restore the house. And really, they did a beautiful job. Like I said before, you would have never noticed the house. They had put a second floor on part of it and added a gable roof, and had painted all of it. And it didn't look modern at all. There was nothing modern about the house before she restored it. So it's really probably one of the, I think, big modernist preservation stories for Arkansas, preservation success stories, just because it was such a gorgeous restoration.
Well, that's fortunate that they saw the beauty in it. I mean, that's the hard part sometimes. I was just going to make a comment about Mr. Wittenberg's house number 1. It's in pretty rough shape. Is it abandoned? Is it vacant? Do you know what the story is with it? Is it still standing or?
Was standing as of a couple weeks ago, but it does have an unsafe vacant sign on it.
So it's vulnerable for demolition. Okay, that's very
Yeah.
discouraging,
And
obviously.
its former twin, which is gone. It obviously is gone. Like it was a mirror image of it on the other side of it, but it has been torn down already.
Very interesting. Well, I don't think we have any other questions coming in. So we just a lot of comments, great presentation, great program. So a lot of folks appreciating it. And it's very interesting. Just kind of, to think about the personalities associated with the properties and, in their careers. So thank you very much, Mason, for sharing that. And I forgot to do it. I meant to send you a t-shirt. So I'm going to send you an appreciation t-shirt since we're not in person. We usually do that. So I'm going to send you one of our I haven't given you a never give up t-shirt yet, have I? So I'll do that. So I'll send you one of those. Oh, lovely. All right. I'm just going to share on my screen again and talk a little bit about our next program that will be coming up in June. There we go. And let me click this. Get my little square block out of the way. There we go. So our next preservation conversation is June 10th at 6 p.m. again, and it is entitled Joseph W. Vestal and Son, Florist and Nurseryman, and it is going to be presented by Sarah Vestal, PhD. So really, really excited about this program. This is one that was sort of sacrificed last year as we were going, we were in between canceling and going virtual, and we decided to just go ahead and hold off on this one and do it this year. We were hoping that we were going to be able to do it in person, but we're just not quite at that stage yet, but we're looking forward to that, obviously. And we will be doing the same format in Zoom. So you'll need to register, or you can you can just join YouTube Live at any time. And if you need information about any of the upcoming programs, you can go to quapaw.com. And if you're a member of the QQA, we mentioned this last month, we have sent out information about our upcoming events. So if you have not gotten a postcard, let us know. We're happy to drop one in the mail, or you can go to quapaw.com and you can get information about all of our programs. So again, thank you all very much for coming tonight. I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Bye, everybody.